So welcome everybody on this lovely sunny evening. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm sure you're as excited as I am. Mark Jones is joining us tonight. He's here now. Okay, so I'm delighted to introduce Mark Jones. The title of Mark's presentation is The Badger Cull: Lies, Damned Lies and Statistics. So Mark Jones is the vet head policy at Born Free Foundation based in Sussex. He has been involved in opposing the badger cull since before it began in 2013. Okay, I'm going to pass over to Mark. And the other thing I forgot to say, just to remind everyone, this is being recorded. Okay, thank you, Mark.
Thank you very much indeed, Jo, for that introduction, and thank you for joining everyone. It's a real honour to be speaking to you tonight. It's a beautiful evening outside. I'm sure you can think of lots of other things you'd like to be doing rather than staring at me on a computer screen, but yeah, thank you very much for giving up your time and joining this evening. As Jo said, my name's Mark Jones. I'm a vet. I qualified from Liverpool University in 1985. I worked for a couple of years, 2 or 3 years, with companion animals, sort of dogs and cats, normal veterinary practice, and then worked for about 15, 20 years in providing veterinary advice and health advice for farmed animals, principally fish, although I did work with other farmed animals as well. And then more recently, I say more recently, it's about 20 years ago now, my wife and I went overseas, and we worked in 2 or 3 wildlife.
Rather than every man.
Just everybody to ensure you have clicked the mute. Okay, please ensure you've muted yourself. Sorry about that.
Thanks, that's no problem. So my wife and I went overseas and worked in 3 different wildlife rescue and rehabilitation centres, 2 in Ecuador, one up in the mountains near Quito, one down in the Amazon basin, not all that far from the border with Brazil. And then we spent about a year at another wildlife rescue and rehabilitation centre in Thailand. And after all that, we came back to the UK. I did some further studying, and then got into the non-government organisation world and got into policy work, because my time spent working with wild animals, wild animal rescue, and many of these wild animals were victims of wildlife trade and trafficking, has got me very interested in the whole issue of wildlife trade. So I started getting involved in wildlife policy issues, and I worked for a couple of different NGOs before joining the Born Free Foundation about 8 years ago, where I'm currently head of policy. And I've been interested in the whole issue of bovine TB controls, Jo said, for a number of years, and particularly the issue of badger culling since about 2010, just around about the time that the Badger Trust was involved in challenging what were then plans to introduce badger culling in Wales, and around about the time that the coalition government, remember those heady days of Nick Clegg and the coalition government came in. David Cameron came into office in Westminster and announced that they would be developing the policy that we're now stuck with today. So I've got some slides. I'm going to share my screen, and I hope this is going to work okay. Can someone tell me whether you can see the slide there?
Perfect.
Great. Okay. So I have a few slides that I'd like to share with you today. Some of my talk today will be familiar to some of you if you saw the talk I gave on the Badger Trust webinar back in early April. So some of it is based on that, but there are some updates as well from them, because quite a lot's happened since myself and 2 colleagues published a paper in the Veterinary Record in March, which has certainly caused some interest in this issue, shall we say. So I hope this will be of interest to you, and I'll work through these slides. The talk will probably take about 35 minutes, I think, and then hopefully we'll have time for a discussion afterwards. So, as I'm sure you're all too well aware, badger culling has arguably been one of the most controversial rural veterinary issues over really the last 50 years, and certainly over the last decade. It involves killing very large numbers of largely healthy animals belonging to a native protected species, and could well result in local disappearance of badgers from areas they've occupied for a very, very long time. It's carried out using methods that can result in injury and prolonged suffering in some badgers. And it has unmeasured ecological impacts on natural wildlife communities across the countryside. The badger is our largest remaining carnivore, although badgers are technically omnivores. But and removing those animals from the ecology is going to have knock-on effects, many of which we probably don't really fully understand. So it's badger culling is certainly extremely controversial. But in spite of all this, proponents of culling, which includes government and prominent members from the farming and veterinary communities, among others, continue to insist that badger culling is critical to the control of bovine TB in cattle. Just to remind ourselves, I suppose, of and give ourselves a sense of scale of what's been going on. Since licensed culling began in the 2 pilot zones in Gloucestershire and Somerset in 2013, some 177,000 badgers have been killed under license across parts of England. Now, more than 70% of these badgers have been killed using so-called controlled shooting. That's the targeting of free roaming badgers at night with rifles, with the remainder being trapped and shot. And the government's own independent expert panel was concerned at the potential for suffering from controlled shooting when it evaluated the humaneness of the method after the first year of culling in 2013. And the British Veterinary Association withdrew its support for the method, yet last year almost 90% of targeted badgers were killed by controlled shooting. And on the graph here, you can see the total bars are the total that represent the total numbers of badgers killed under license each year. And the blue bars, the blue segment of the bars represents those killed by controlled shooting. Now, most, but not all, of the licensed badger culling has taken place across the designated high-risk area for bovine TB in England. And that's the area in brown on the map on the right of your screen. The high-risk area covers 12 counties currently, and roughly an area of 37,000 square kilometres. And by the time we got to the culling that took place in autumn 2021, we believe the proportion of the high-risk area that was subject to culling reached about 75%. So what that means is in 2021, licensed badger culling was probably taking place across an area of roughly 27,000 square kilometres. Now that's an area considerably larger than the total land area of Wales. And of course, that's a really unfortunate analogy, since Wales has not adopted a policy of licensed mass culling of badgers, in spite of suffering comparable problems with bovine TB, and we'll come to that a little bit later. Throughout the rollout of the badger culling policy, the government and its advisors have insisted that badger culling is working and that it is a necessary tool in the box for controlling bovine TB. In May last year, the Secretary of State for Environment, George Eustace, stated that the badger cull has led to a significant reduction in the disease. And in their reports on the 2021 culling operations, DEFRA's chief scientific advisor expressed confidence that the culls were achieving disease control benefits. And the chief veterinary officer stated that the likelihood of suffering in badgers killed by controlled shooting was comparable to that reported for the hunting or killing of other terrestrial mammals. And they've repeatedly said, they've repeatedly defended controlled shooting on the basis that it's comparable to methods of killing other species that are supposedly accepted by society. And these kind of statements that we've seen reflect others that have been consistently made throughout the rollout of the policy. However, the only measure of whether badger culling is working is whether it's resulting in a substantial and predictable reduction in bovine TB in cattle. That is, after all, why it's been introduced. And so far, evidence for this has been at best sparse and inconclusive. The government tends to rely on an analysis published in 2019 by scientists from its own Animal and Plant Health Agency, or APHA, the so-called Down study. And this study examined data from the 3 pilot cull areas in Gloucestershire, Somerset and Dorset over the period 2013 to 2017. Now, the authors of the study claimed their statistical modelling identified decreases in bovine TB incidence rates, that's the rate of new herd breakdowns, among cattle herds of roughly 66% in the Gloucestershire cull zone and 37% in the Somerset cull zone, in comparison to selected unculled control areas. So note that what they're claiming here is a relative and not an absolute reduction in bovine TB incidence in cattle, contrary to what some cull proponents have claimed in media reports. And the authors concluded that there were statistically significant decreases in cattle TB incidence in the Gloucestershire and Somerset intervention areas after 4 years of culling, and that industry-led culling was associated with reductions in cattle TB incidence rates after 4 years, but there were variations in effects between areas. Those authors also stated that given the observational nature of the study, we cannot exclude biases in our results due, for example, to unknown or unmeasured confounding, and that we recommend that evaluation of the effects of culling continues. Taking a somewhat different approach, my veterinary colleague Ian McGill and I, and you may have seen Ian speak at various different seminars and also marches and meetings and so on, very passionately on this issue. So Ian McGill and I examined the same data extended by a further year, and we found little or no evidence of a downward trend in the prevalence. Now, that's the proportion of infected cattle herds at a point in time of bovine TB within the culled areas over a 5-year period. We published these findings in the form of what they call a debate article in the Veterinary Record in 2019. And we strongly contended that the main factor contributing to the ongoing TB epidemic in cattle is not infection in badgers, but rather the high number of infected cattle that fail to be detected by the standard skin test, and that this hidden burden of infection is what needs to be addressed and dramatically reduced if TB is to be brought ultimately under control. Now, both of these studies, both the Down study and Ian McGill and I's study, only looked at limited data sets from early cull zones. But as we've seen, culling has since been rolled out to vast areas of the country. Yet, up until now, no further analysis has been forthcoming from government to justify its claims that the culls are working. So a few months back, ecologist Tom Langton, and again, you may have seen Tom speak at various meetings and webinars. So ecologist Tom Langton, Ian McGill, and myself, with the help of many others, set about conducting our own much more extensive and robust analysis, which resulted in our paper being published in the Veterinary Record in March of this year, following a lengthy and rigorous peer review process. So our study examined government data, remember this is government data, on the incidence and prevalence of bovine TB in cattle herds across the entire high-risk area over the period 2009 to 2020. As we've seen already, this encompasses a large area of around 37,000 square kilometres. And again, I've put the map up there. It's the brown area on the map. The data we examined covered the first 30 cull areas to be licensed in the high-risk area and consisted of more than 200,000 herd tests, comprising literally millions of individual cattle tests. Now, Government doesn't reveal the exact locations of badger cull zones. However, it does release data on the number of cattle herds and the incidence and prevalence of bovine TB among those herds for the entire high-risk area and from within badger cull zones, enabling us by a process of subtraction to figure out the incidence and prevalence in the as yet unculled parts of the high-risk area in any particular year. So we did two things. We compared bovine TB incidence and prevalence among cattle herds in areas subject to badger culling and areas that were not subject to badger culling across the whole high-risk areas for each of the first 6 years in which culling took place. These are all the years for which we had the detailed data at the time we started the analysis. And we also looked at overall trends in herd TB incidence over the period 2009 to 2020. So what did we find? Well, let's start with the comparison of herd incidence. Badger cull years run across sort of 2 calendar years, with culling typically taking place, most culling typically taking place in the September to December, January window. So our study considered all herd breakdowns for each year from 2013 to 14, when badger culling first began, through to 2018 to 19. We've included incidents on this graph here for the 3 years before culling began for comparison. So if you look at the bars on this graph, you can see a general trend here. The incidence of TB among cattle herds is rising early on from 2010, peaks around 2013-14 or 2014-15, and then begins to start to fall away over the rest of the period. So the blue bars represent the herd incidence in unculled areas across the whole of the HRA for each individual year. And of course, for the first 3 years represented on this graph, there was no culling. So they represent the whole of the high-risk area. The red bars represent which start in 2013-14 onwards, represent the herd incidence rate in culled areas for that year. So for the first 3 years of culling, from 2013-14 onwards, it only took place in the 3 pilot cull areas, which totaled under 1,000 kilometres squared. And culling was rolled out to wider areas from 2016 onwards. The relatively small cull areas in those first 3 years explain the larger confidence intervals on the red bars in those years. So you can see, I don't know if you can see my pointer on the screen, but you've got the confidence intervals, statistical confidence intervals here, and they're quite wide in those culled areas for the first 3 years, but then they reduce in size as the culled areas get larger. But the graph shows no obvious difference in herd incidence between culled and unculled areas for each year. If anything, culled areas seem to experience slightly higher herd incidence in most years, as you can see. When it comes to prevalence, so that's the proportion of cattle herds that are infected at a point in time, we see a very, very similar pattern with no clear difference between culled and unculled areas, although herd prevalence is again slightly higher in culled areas in most years. And again, on this chart, the red bars indicate herd prevalence at the end of the year, at the end of each of these years in the culled areas, and the blue bars represent the unculled areas. So from this analysis, there's certainly no sign that culling is reducing the cattle TB reservoir. Of course, there are limitations to this analysis, which we fully acknowledged in the paper. Firstly, we didn't have access to the data for each individual badger cull area because government keeps that secret. That secrecy does limit our ability to look for possible confounding variables that might influence the results, because there may be different things going on in different cull areas. On the other hand, given our study looks at a very large amount of data across a large area, the impact of any confounders within individual zones diminishes. And that's really the strength of the study we've conducted here. It's the fact that we've looked at such a big data set over a relatively long period of time. If culling badgers has a substantial impact on bovine TB in cattle as government claims, and as would surely be required to justify the policy, at the very least, this should be clearly detectable in our data after 6 years. Now, we've been criticised for including all areas that were subject to culling in any particular year within the culled area for our analysis. And this, of course, includes those areas that were in the first year of culling during that year. And the criticism says that you wouldn't necessarily expect to see an immediate impact during the first year of culling, and there may be some truth in that. However, even if you take this into account, we would still have expected to see a substantial impact within culled areas in our analysis as more and more of those areas enter their second, third, fourth year of culling and so forth as we move through the period. But we saw no such impact at all. To carry out and conduct a more sophisticated examination of this data, we use a whole load of statistical methods, including a series of generalized linear and linear mixed models, additive and additive mixed models. I'm saying this as if I know what I'm talking about. I'm not a statistician, and we had a lot of help from people who are very, very familiar with these statistical techniques. So we use them to do a robust statistical analysis, comparing herd TB incidence and prevalence in the culled areas with the unculled areas. But none of these statistical comparisons indicated any positive effect from badger culling. And one model even suggested that badger culling is associated with an increase in incidence of TB in cattle herds. Now, if we step back a bit and look at the overall trends in bovine TB over time, here's a reminder of where levels of cattle TB have been in the high-risk area in England, going back to the mid-1990s. We've heard incidence adjusted for changes in the density of cattle herds over time. Now, the graph shows that incidence begins to level off in around 2014, as we saw in our own data, followed by a decline. Now, this should be a good news story because it indicates that some aspects of DEFRA's policy and the efforts of farmers seem to be working, but it doesn't tell you why. So to get a better idea, we looked at the data from 2009, 2010 onwards in a bit more detail. If you look at the incidence data for the 5 central west counties in England in the high-risk area, as shown in red in the map on the right, you'll notice that herd incidence in these counties peaks at around somewhere around 2011 to 2013, a bit earlier than it does across the high-risk area as a whole. That's the black line on the graph. Now, we know that bovine TB can reach much higher saturations in herds than the peak indicated here. So this does suggest that DEFRA's cattle interventions are beginning to show some effect. Despite the limitations of the tuberculin skin test missing infected animals, the interventions are doing enough to level off and start to reduce the incidence of breakdowns from about 2013 onwards in places with no badger culling. And the arrows on the graphs here pick out exactly when badger culling was first started in each of the counties. That's at least in one relatively small part of each county. If you look at the 6 southwest counties within the high-risk area, we also see quite a noticeable synchronized pattern of rise and fall. The peak in bovine TB incidence happened a bit later in about 2015, with the exception of Dorset, where it peaked in around 2014. And apart from in Somerset, cattle TB incidence peaks and begins to fall in each county before the first badger cull starts. This really indicates that something other than badger culling is resulting in this levelling off and gradual decline in bovine TB across the high-risk area. Now, of course, this in and of itself doesn't exclude the possibility that culling may still be having some influence. So we need to look a bit harder at the data for more answers. If you compare the 2 counties in which culling has taken place over the largest areas for the longest time, that's Devon and Dorset, with the least and most recently culled counties of Avon and Shropshire, they show roughly the same patterns of response over time. And this indicates that something other than badger culling is likely to have been responsible. And If we compare overall herd incidence in the high-risk area of England with that in the high-risk area of Wales, in which there's been no mass culling of badgers, as I mentioned earlier, the pattern of peak and decline over time is roughly similar, albeit it's lower in any particular year in Wales overall. So the roughly 25% decline in bovine TB incidence across the HRA that we've seen since around 2015 should be a good news story. It suggests that the millions spent over the last, say, 10 years on testing, compensation and other cattle measures is beginning to have some effect, even if progress has been slow, certainly compared to the results achieved in the early 60s, where there was something like an 80% TB reduction over just 4 years. But just like back then, this success doesn't seem to be dependent on culling badgers. So in our paper, we briefly outline the cattle-based measures that have been introduced to the high-risk areas since 2010. Now, I'm not going to go into these in detail here, but it seems to us that it's these measures that are much more likely to have been responsible for the peak and gradual decline in bovine TB that we've seen across the high-risk area. Now, our study was published in the Veterinary Record I think it was on the 18th or 19th of March of this year. And interestingly, DEFRA responded on that day, on the 18th of March, and also responded in the Veterinary Record itself, because the Veterinary Record had taken it on itself to send a copy of our paper to DEFRA for them to comment before it was published. And that's extremely unusual for an independent journal with a very robust peer review process. Nevertheless, they did publish. We were really concerned that they were going to perhaps bow to pressure and not publish the paper, but they did publish the paper. But alongside it, they also published a response from DEFRA. The DEFRA press office on the day and put out a press release, which some of you might have seen, accusing us of producing a paper to fit a clear campaign agenda and of manipulating data. Now, in response, we made it very clear that it's no secret that all 3 authors of the paper have been campaigning against the badger culls since before they began in 2013, on the basis that they're unscientific, ineffective, inhumane, and unnecessary. And all 3 of us declared our long-standing opposition to badger culling and associated campaigning activities in the paper itself. However, that doesn't take anything away from the validity of the study, which we believe is comprehensive, is transparent. Anyone with the requisite statistical skills should be able to repeat our study and repeat the statistical analysis, and should arrive at exactly the same results using the same government data set. Our paper was also subject to really rigorous peer review, and bear in mind, I believe the majority of papers submitted to the Veterinary Record do not survive the peer review process and never get published, or certainly not in the record. So it was a really robust process. It took us several months to get the paper through peer review to a point where all of the reviewers were happy for us to publish. The data we use for the study is government data. And as I've said before, we include all the data available to us from the whole of the high-risk area in the analysis. So we weren't selective. The only thing we selected was, whether or not culling had or hadn't taken place, badger culling had or hadn't taken place within an area, so we could make a comparison. But beyond that, we used the entire data set. So we argue that there's been absolutely no manipulation of data or selection of data at all. We've asked the Secretary of State, the Chief Vets, the Chief Scientific Advisor and other DEFRA officials to meet with us to discuss our analysis. Although while there's been some discourse in the Veterinary Record since we published the paper, which I'll come to, DEFRA has thus far failed to respond to our request for a meeting. The other thing that DEFRA said was that it's disappointing to see our paper published in a scientific journal. And to me, that's a real slight by a government department on an independent journal and its peer review process. And it's surely not for DEFRA spokespeople in their media department to suggest what should or shouldn't be published by independent researchers in respected and peer-reviewed scientific journal. So you know, our strong feeling was that that was a statement that the DEFRA press office had no business making whatsoever. And I think, you know, for all of us, I think I speak for all three authors to say that DEFRA's response was, more than anything, it was very disappointing. It was quite clear from the outset that they weren't interested in looking at the analysis, maybe considering our analysis, maybe talking to us about our analysis in order to discuss and come to some kind of decision as to whether it has relevance. We certainly believe it has relevance for policy. But we would have hoped that they would have come to us with a view to discussing this and at least giving us an opportunity to explain, you know, why we think this is important. But the route they took was to make every attempt to discredit our paper and to discredit us as authors, and indirectly to try and undermine the credibility of the veterinary record and its peer review process. And to see a government department doing that because a scientific paper doesn't agree with government policy is very, very disappointing indeed. Now, as I've said, before our paper was published, the veterinary record shared it with DEFRA officials and invited them to comment. What this resulted in was that the chief vet and chief scientist published a graph, published a letter which included a graph in the same edition of the veterinary record as our paper was published. Their graph is the one that you can see on the screen here. And what their graph apparently shows is that that areas that are subject to culling, they've basically done something vaguely similar to what we've done, but instead of lumping all the culled areas together, they've separated them out. So what you have here is the blue bars, which represent their control areas, their non-culled areas, and they decided only to use areas that had never been culled at all throughout the entire period to date, rather than areas. What we did was use comparison areas which comprised of areas that hadn't been culled to that point in time, but parts of which may have come into culling at a later date. So they were much more selective in their in the control areas they used, and they're the blue bars on this graph here. And then you've got a number of different coloured bars, and these are areas that have come into culling. So the red bar represents the first three areas of culling in Somerset, Dorset and Gloucestershire, which started in 2013, 2015 for Dorset. And then you've got this sort of light brown bar, which are the areas that came into culling that were first licensed in 2016. You've got a yellow bar, which are the areas that came into culling in 2017. You've got a pink bar, which are the areas for 2018. And then at the end here, you've got a brown bar, which are the ones that came into effect in 2019. So basically, they've split out the different the cull areas that came into force in different years. So what they claim this shows is, and if you look at the comparison, particularly between their unculled areas, their never culled areas, as we call them, and the red bars, which are the areas that came into culling very early on, they're saying that over time, when we start off early on in that process, the incidence of bovine TB and cattle herds in those two areas is roughly the same. But then over time, you start to see a difference with the reduction in bovine TB incidence in the culled areas as compared to the blue unculled areas. And you can see that right through their analysis here. And so they're claiming that the incidence rates of bovine TB in cattle reduce significantly in cull areas compared to areas that have never been culled. What they didn't do was provide the data on which this graph was based. And we can't repeat this analysis because they hide the data from specific cull zones. They only give you the sort of total for all of the cull zones for any particular year. Bear in mind that this graph was produced, it was produced in a bit of a hurry in order that it could be published at the same time as our paper. It wasn't subject to any peer review. And as I say, they didn't provide the background data. So we're all supposed to take it on faith that this is based on some kind of robust analysis. However, a few weeks later, after several attempts by us to get hold of the data, we got an email from DEFRA apologising for what they called incorrect calculations in their original graph, specifically in the way they calculated herd incidence in the unculled areas. And they produced a corrected graph, and that was published in the veterinary record in early May. Now, I'm going to put the corrected graph on. Look what happens to the blue bars. So all the other bars remain the same, but the incidence rates among cattle herds in their never culled areas has significantly reduced. And I'll just go back to the original. And then if you look at sort of 2016 onwards in particular, when you go to their corrected graph, the incidence in their unculled areas has reduced significantly. And this makes a massive difference. And you know, by 2019 to 20, even by 2019 to 20, 7 years after culling began in the original pilot zones, and with many other areas reaching their 3rd and 4th year of culling, there's really no significant difference between the incidence of bovine TB in their culled and unculled areas. There are differences in the bars. They're nowhere near as marked as they were in their original graph, but look at the error bars, the sort of confidence intervals. They all pretty much overlap, which means that there's really no statistical difference between the culled areas and the unculled areas, regardless of how long those culled areas have been culled for. Now, amazingly, DEFRA says this makes no difference to their claims the cull is working. We say it makes all the difference. And what we say is that their corrected graph effectively corroborates our own findings that culling badgers isn't reducing TB in cattle, or if it is having any effect, it's so marginal as to make culling completely unjustifiable. So what about the animal welfare implications? Well, as you may remember, and as I mentioned earlier, an independent expert panel was established back in 2012, 2013 to look at the efficacy and humaneness of controlled shooting during the first year of the pilot culls back in 2013. And that independent expert panel concluded that in order to be considered humane, controlled shooting should result in less than 5% of targeted badgers taking more than 5 minutes to die. The real issue that we have with controlled shooting, you know, we have huge issues with killing badgers in the first place, but the real issue we have with controlled shooting is that there is a very high likelihood, given that it's being done in the dark, given the morphology of badgers with their really, strong shoulders, lots of shoulder muscle, they're being targeted in the chest. There's a real high risk of badgers being shot and injured and either not retrieved, so nobody really knows what happens to them, or perhaps only retrieved after they've been pursued and shot, another 1, 2, 3 times or whatever. But anyway, the independent expert panel decided that if more than 5% of badgers took more than 5 minutes to die, then that would be considered, that would make the method inhumane in their view. And they looked at data from independent observations of controlled shooting events, as well as post-mortem examination of culled badgers during that very first year of culling. And they found that between 7.4 and 22.8% of targeted badgers that were shot at were still alive after 5 minutes and at risk, as they said, of experiencing marked pain. They also found that it was very likely that less than half of targeted badgers were hit in the target area recommended in the best practice guidance. And as I said earlier, in 2015, the British Veterinary Association concluded that it could no longer support the use of controlled shooting as part of the badger control policy. In spite of this, as we've already seen, around 70% of the 177,000 badgers killed to date have been killed using controlled shooting, and the proportion killed by this method goes up each year. Why is that? Well, it's easier, it's cheaper, than trapping and shooting. So it's the method that's preferred by the cull companies. Now, DEFRA's scientific advisors continue to claim that the level of accuracy of controlled shooting, as I've said, compares favourably with the range of outcomes when other control activities currently accepted apparently by society have been assessed. However, these statements rolled out every year seem to have very, very little basis, if any, in evidence. In 2013, 88 of the just over 1,000 controlled shooting events, or roughly 8.5% of those controlled shooting events, were observed by Natural England observers. And it was the data that they generated that helped to inform the independent expert panel. By 2021, this had reduced to 86 observations of the almost 30,000 controlled shooting events. Now, that's less than 0.3%. Now, throughout that period, the proportion of observed shot at but not retrieved events has remained roughly the same. Unsurprisingly, perhaps, reports from the shooters themselves, when unobserved, suggested much lower rates of badgers being shot at and not retrieved. And that suggests that either shooters, for some reason, are much more accurate when they're not being watched, or they're not reporting the data properly, and we strongly suspect the latter. Also, post-mortems on cull badgers have not been routinely carried out to examine where or how many times they've been shot. So quite how DEFRA comes to the conclusion that controlled shooting is acceptable from a humanist perspective is completely unclear. And we should also remember that our welfare concerns are not only with those badgers that are targeted by controlled shooting. We also have some serious concerns about the conditions in which trapping and shooting is conducted. And of course, badgers are highly social and sentient creatures, as is now recognised in UK law. So there will be implications for the survivors as well in terms of the loss of social structure and cohesion and so forth. And that's going to have welfare implications. So where do we go from here? Well, looking forward, the government is proposing to focus on the long-awaited development of cattle vaccines and to expand the option of vaccinating badgers. And when it comes to badger culling, the government's made a big song and dance about proposing to cease issuing new culling licenses after 2022, after this year, and to consider cutting short existing licenses after 2 years where supported by what they call sufficient scientific evidence, although it's not exactly clear what supporting evidence would be required. However, the government intends to retain the option of culling badgers in response to breakdowns among cattle herds where epidemiological assessment indicates that it's needed. Again, it's not clear what this epidemiological evidence might consist of. And in any event, this kind of reactive culling failed in the randomised badger culling trial in Cumbria and in the Republic of Ireland. Yet, just a few days after they published their corrected graph in the veterinary record, DEFRA announced supplementary licenses for 29 cull areas, which could see as many as 25,000 more badgers culled over this summer. This policy could result in badgers being shot under license for many, many years to come, and none of us should be under any illusions that the rhetoric coming from DEFRA suggests otherwise. So in conclusion, our, we believe, robustly peer-reviewed analysis found that over the first 6 years of culling since 2013, badger culling was not associated with reductions in the incidence or prevalence of bovine TB herd breakdowns across the high-risk area. DEFRA's corrected non-peer-reviewed graph appears to confirm that conclusion, at least with respect to incidence. We therefore conclude that badger culling has made no meaningful contribution to the control of TB in cattle, as was predicted by the independent scientific group that analysed and reported on the data from the randomised badger culling trial as far back as 2007. And the decline in incidence within the high-risk area between 2010 and 2020 is much more likely to be the result of cattle-based disease control measures. Now, we believe that our findings have very serious implications for current and future bovine TB control policy. From the perspectives of both farmers and taxpayers, funds and effort spent on badger culling would be much better deployed to cattle interventions that can seriously contribute to tackling bovine TB. So we're making every effort to put further pressure on Number 10, DEFRA ministers and its officials to revise the policy and bring an immediate and permanent end to all lethal control of badgers. So that's kind of where we are. Thank you very much for listening. I hope that's given you an indication of where things have got to. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to present our findings once again. Our paper, just to remind you, our paper is open access and available to all online. If anyone hasn't seen it, I can put a link in the chat in a short while. And a shortened summary version was produced for the print version of the veterinary record. So do please check that out if you haven't done so already. And I'll stop there. I've probably gone on for long enough on a Wednesday evening, so I'll stop there and hand back to you, Jo.
Thank you, Mark. I'm just going to see if we've got any questions. Cheryl, are you ready there with any questions?
Yeah, we've just got the one at the moment, so please give us questions if you got them, everybody. Is the BVA still openly opposed to controlled shooting?
Yeah, the BVA's position hasn't changed. It took them a while to arrive at the position, but they eventually, what they did was they looked at the independent expert panel's conclusions from their first year of culling, and then the independent expert panel made a number of recommendations, which you can go and look at the report. There are recommendations in there, but they basically said, if you're going to continue with this policy, the accuracy of controlled shooting needs to be substantially improved in order for the methodology to be considered in any way humane, and the monitoring should be continued and seriously stepped up. So what BVA did was they kind of waited for another year to see what DEFRA would do, but the level of monitoring in the second and third year, the number of controlled shooting events that were monitored stayed at about the same level, whereas the number of badgers that were being targeted by controlled shooting was going up all the time. And there was no change at all from the monitored controlled shooting events in the shot and missed or shot and not retrieved proportions. So I think it was in 2015, the British Veterinary Association eventually came out and said, we support the need for some kind of intervention in badgers, but we encourage government not to include controlled shooting as a method. And that's been their position ever since. They've got themselves in a bit of a mess with this BVA, because basically what they're saying is, we don't agree with controlled shooting because we don't think it's humane, but we do support the continuation of the badger culling policy. And of course, the badger culling policy includes the option and of controlled shooting, which is now overwhelmingly the predominant method by which badgers are killed. So, I do think the British Veterinary Association's got itself in a bit of a mess over this.
Brilliant. A few more questions coming in now. Were you able to see where Downs et al. Got their figures from? And another one asking, are you thinking about this type of analysis for vaccinated areas versus control areas?
Okay, the Downs, there's always been an issue. When scientists, independent researchers, any researchers publish in peer-reviewed journals, ideally they're supposed to provide the background data on which their analysis has been carried out and on which their results and conclusions are based, so that another scientist, another researcher could take the same data and do the analysis, and you would hope, if the analysis has been robust, reach the same results. Whether you reach the same conclusions or not is a different matter, but they should be able to basically repeat the analysis. But we've never been able to do that with the Downs study, because the Downs study was very selective in the way that particularly they tried to select control areas to compare with the culled areas. And my understanding from people who have tried to do this is that whilst the Down study and the analysis that they did, and there was a lot of modeling involved, and it was very, very difficult to follow exactly what they did. But while they appeared to show quite a substantial relative reduction in bovine TB incidence among cattle herds in culled areas compared to unculled areas, they were using about 10 unculled areas. And if you removed 1 or 2 outliers from those unculled areas, there was no difference at all. That's my understanding. So the Down study has been very controversial, but we haven't been able to replicate it exactly because they've never been prepared to release the data in the form that would allow us to identify the exact areas that they use for comparison.
Okay, we've got questions coming in thick and fast now. And the next one is a 2-part question from someone who says, this may seem a very naive question, but why is this happening? Who benefits or profits from data manipulation or hiding? Who benefits from TB? Surely vaccine development, which has in this country proven recently very proficient, could be achieved with admirable efficacy.
That's a very interesting question. The question as to why government has doggedly continued to pursue this policy when, as I say, what we've said all along is if you're going to justify this policy, at the very least, you've got to be able to show a substantial and predictable reduction in TB in cattle as a direct result of culling badgers. They've now been culling badgers for 9 years. They've culled 177,000 of them, and we can't see a difference. And if you look at the graphs that DEFRA are producing, they don't appear to be showing a difference either, although they still claim that they think it's working. But it's not good enough. It's nowhere near good enough to say, well, okay, the data's a bit difficult, and this is real world data. This isn't a controlled trial that we're conducting here. This is real world data from the field, and the data it's messy, and it's quite difficult to interpret sometimes. But if there was a substantial and predictable reduction in TB in cattle, you'd see it very, very clearly, and we just don't see it. So how they're continuing to try and justify this policy, my own view is that they've spent so many years now telling farmers in very simple language that they have to engage in badger interventions in order to control TB in cattle, using all the old cliches. You have to use every tool in the box, and no other country has controlled TB without controlling the wildlife reservoir. All these kind of, on the face of it, very simple messages. It's made it almost impossible for them to back out now and admit that they were wrong. So I think there's a lot of politics here, and there's a lot of people who've spent an awful long time and staked a good bit of their careers within government, with government officials and so forth, on supporting and rolling out this policy. And it's going to be very hard for those people to admit that the policy hasn't worked.
Okay,
that's just speculation.
Yeah. I think a lot of people would probably agree with that. Another question, would testing cattle before they leave farms with the newer version of TB test not be a better way to reduce the spread of TB? It would seem DEFRA are blocking cattle and badger vaccination in favour of data they don't want to publish. In order to
that's another really interesting question. We've all just been through, what is it now, 2 and a bit years of COVID with all kinds of lockdowns. Thankfully we're coming out of it. COVID hasn't gone away by any means, but we've all been through a bit of a horrendous time. But I think what the general public probably understands more than it ever has in the past are the kind of measures that you need to take if you're going to try and control an infectious disease. Now, COVID is a virus. It's a very different pathogen than Mycobacterium bovis that causes bovine TB. Nevertheless, the principles of control are the same. You have to reduce contact. You have to reduce the opportunities for the pathogen to spread from one host to another, whether that's a person or a cow or whatever. And you do that by identifying infected individuals and preventing them from coming into contact with uninfected individuals, so that you break the cycle. And ultimately, as we've seen with COVID, mass vaccination programs are a really, really important and effective way of trying to deal with epidemics and pandemics. And the principles are the same for cattle. So yes, of course, if most of the studies that have been done on the skin test, the standard test that's used to identify TB infected cattle, suggests that the sensitivity of those tests at an individual cattle level are probably about 50%. In other words, for every 10 infected cattle that you test, you probably miss 5 of them. So what you're doing is removing the positive cattle, but leaving a substantial reservoir of infected animals within the herd. And you can get to the point where the whole herd might test negative, but there are still infected cattle within that herd. And if that herd then gets released from restrictions, then animals from that herd can then be transferred to other herds, and that can result in disease spread. So the disease will continue to spread within the herd and potentially to other herds as well. So yeah, more accurate testing and removal of cattle. If your aim is to eliminate TB in cattle, then more accurate testing and removal of cattle is an essential component. But what I think they're terrified of is if they had a brilliant test that could identify every infected cattle, that's going to be a hell of a lot more cattle that they're going to have to slaughter early than they're doing at the moment. And that's just not a tenable position for them to be in. And I can't say whether that's resulted in delays in new tests, because there are new, much more accurate tests coming through now. I can't say whether that's resulted in delays in tests, but it does make you think, because if you introduced a test tomorrow that identified every infected cattle, it would devastate parts of the farming industry if they continue with the test and slaughter policy.
Yeah, the next two, I think one is more of a statement which you may or may not have a thought on, and then there's a question. Somebody has lived in an area that they've lived in all their lives and has found evidence of shooting in the area, even though it's never had any cattle, and they're surprised and wondered why that happens. And then somebody else asking, what did we do to decrease BTB in the 60s, and what has changed to cause the percentage increase?
Yeah. Okay, so in terms of badgers being shot in areas where, and I'm not sure whether they're saying that there's no cattle, but because logically you would think that if government was going to suggest an intervention in badgers to try and control TB in cattle, they'd focus on areas where there are lots of cattle, lots of badgers, and lots of TB. But that's not actually what happens here. The criteria for licensing of cull zones isn't dependent on the density of cattle or the density of badgers or whether the populations of cattle and badgers overlap. It's dependent on their ability to access land in the area and to deposit funds to enable it to go ahead. So there's actually lots of areas where badgers that come within cull zones where there aren't many cattle. Don't get me wrong, the cattle density in the west and southwest of England is quite high, but there are areas within that where there are very few cattle, but that doesn't mean that those areas won't end up being incorporated into a cull zone. So that might be why some of those badgers are being shot. And the other thing that we're really concerned about as well is that obviously if you don't have a license and you're not shooting within a cull zone, then any disturbance of badgers or badger sets is illegal under the Protection of Badgers Act. So, we think that there may be some farmers, landowners that have taken the law into their own hands in areas where they haven't got cull license and have shot badgers. And then some of those badgers may appear on the road, or they may try and, move those carcasses in some other way, or somehow incorporate them into the carcasses that are coming from the cull zones, the sort of legally shot badgers. It's very difficult to get good evidence of that, but there is real concern that the cull has, if you like, stimulated and enabled a certain amount of illegal activity. And when you come back to the sort of 60s, 70s, it was really interesting. Back in the 50s, when they first introduced statutory testing of cattle, TB rates were quite high, fairly comparable to what they are now, perhaps a little bit lower than they are now, but they were still quite high. And there was really intensive testing. Bear in mind, back then, there were a lot more cattle herds, but the herds were much smaller. And the degree to which cattle were moved around the country was less than it is now. We have, I think we are right in saying that we have roughly the same numbers of head of cattle in the UK, but those cattle are distributed on far fewer farms now, because the farms are generally much bigger on average than they used to be. And bigger farms make it more difficult to control disease once it gets into those herds. So, there's an element of that. There was really, really strict movement restrictions imposed on infected herds back in the 50s and 60s, and they did manage to get bovine TB down to very low levels through the sort of 70s, 80s, and it was really and they started to relax testing, and that the levels started to creep up again. And then we had foot and mouth. And it was, in foot and mouth, obviously devastated the cattle industry. Many tens of thousands of cattle were slaughtered. And after foot and mouth, they lifted all the movement controls on cattle for TB so that farmers could restock. And the TB levels went up exponentially after foot and mouth. And that's really what precipitated where we are today, the sort of endemic high levels of TB that we have today. So yeah, it's you can say, well, you can perhaps understand why they lifted restrictions after foot and mouth, because the farming industry had been completely devastated by foot and mouth. Nevertheless, there's been pretty devastating consequences of that particular policy.
Yeah, absolutely. Another question here. I'm surprised DEFRA decided to issue the apology and more accurate data. Were they afraid the more accurate data would get into the hands of those campaigning against the cull before DEFRA admitted their errors? I haven't heard about this previously, so thank you for educating us with your crucial info.
Thanks very much. It's you can again the corrected graph, and to be fair to the veterinary record, we were quite upset when we found out that they'd sent our paper pre-publication to DEFRA, because normally, in a peer-reviewed journal, you go through the peer review process. If you're successful, then your paper will get published, and then there's usually a couple of weeks while people absorb the information in the paper, and those that wish to respond, usually through letters pages or perhaps with some kind of alternative analysis or whatever. For us, it was all published on the same day, and we were very upset about that. But what we did on the back of that was we went straight back to DEFRA, the chief scientist and the chief vet and DEFRA officials, and said, you've produced a graph, you've just stuck a graph in a letter in the veterinary record, but there's no data to back up that graph. Give us the data. And we kept asking and asking and asking for the data. And I think they'd obviously gone back and reviewed their analysis, which had, by all accounts, been done in quite a hurry. And I think they must have got to the point where they thought, these guys are putting in freedom of information requests. At some point, they're going to take us to tribunals if we don't release this data. And we've now discovered that the data was incorrect. So they were kind of forced into a corner where they had to print a correction. when I say they apologized, they wrote to us before they published the corrected graph and said, we apologize. I forget the exact wording, but it said something like, it was an email to Tom Langton, the lead author on the paper, on our paper. And they said, you know, we apologize for the fact that some of the data in our analysis was incorrectly calculated. We've produced a corrected version, but we don't believe that this makes any difference to our positional conclusions. What they haven't done, and what we've asked them to do on the back of that, is to issue a public apology for some of the criticisms that they threw at us at the time that we published our paper, you know, suggesting that we'd manipulated data, that we were pursuing a campaign agenda, and that our paper shouldn't have been published in the veterinary record. You know, for them to publish something which was not only non-peer reviewed without any data, but as it turns out wrong, was appalling. And we certainly felt that we were due an apology. But more important than that, we really wanted them to come to the table so we could say, okay, you know, this is supposed to be an evidence-based policy. The evidence, the peer-reviewed evidence that's in front of us right now is the paper that we've just published, which says it's not working. So there's a serious issue here, and we need to discuss it. But they flatly refused to do that. They've simply refused all of our efforts to open a dialogue on this particular issue, and that's really, really disappointing. This is a serious issue, and you know, they should at least be prepared to discuss the implications of new evidence and new science as it comes forward.
Another one here for you. Hi, thanks, Mark. My question is the culling allowed to run just at times of the year with no breaks like they do with fishing to allow for breeding and rearing young? If it's just they kill so many breeding adults and not so many young, born, let alone raised, this will have a knock-on effect on the next generation.
Certainly will. So the when the cull licenses are issued for the areas are going through, when you get a license for a cull area, you get the idea is that you cull badgers in that area in the first year to reduce the population by around 70% or more, and then you continue to cull in the next 3 years to maintain the population at a low level. That's the theory. It doesn't quite work like that, but that's the theory. And when those first licenses are issued for those first 4 years, they're usually issued around about the end of August, beginning of September, and the cull companies can use controlled shooting until at the end of January, or trapping and shooting to the end of December. After they've completed 4 years of culling, they've introduced what's called supplementary culls. And these are the licenses that have just recently been issued. And those licenses run from those open seasons, if you like, for those licenses run from June, again, to the end of January for controlled shooting, the end of December for trapping and shooting. So badgers are being killed in some of those areas that have been culling for quite a long period of time, as we speak. Or they might be being killed, I don't know for sure, but there may well be culling going on in some of those supplementary cull areas, more or less as we speak.
Brilliant. There's two together here now, both regarding DEFRA. And what do DEFRA think would be a successful outcome? That's one question. And the next one is there any evidence that badgers even come into regular contact with cattle, or is this just one of the many things DEFRA are hiding?
What would DEFRA consider to be a successful outcome? Well, the only reason that these cull licenses are being issued legally is to control disease in cattle. That's the only reason. Some people have talked about the need to reduce badger populations. Badgers are overpopulated. They're becoming a pest. They're becoming a nuisance or whatever. That's not why these licenses are being issued. The only reason they're being issued is to control disease, control bovine TB in cattle. So from our perspective, and we've said this all along, the only justification for the culls must be a substantial and predictable reduction in cattle TB. Now, you may continue to oppose the culls, even if that were happening on ethical grounds or whatever. You may think that, you know, that may think quite justifiably, in my view, that that doesn't necessarily justify killing, you know, large numbers of a protected wild animal. But at the very least, they should be showing a substantive and predictable reduction in bovine TB in cattle, and it's simply not the case. Simply not the case. So it's hard to say. But DEFRA keeps saying how successful this is, and you know, we're saying to DEFRA, well, how, you know, on what basis are you saying it's successful? Where's the evidence? It's just not there. The what was the second question again? I'm sorry.
Is there any evidence that badgers come into regular contact
Oh, yes.
with cattle?
There are a couple of papers which seem to indicate that badgers and cattle actually tend to avoid each other. I mean, there's certainly quite a lot of overlap between, you know, badger territories and cattle farms, but there are a couple of papers out there that where people have studied the behaviour of badgers and cattle, and actually badgers and cattle tend to avoid each other if they can. So the theory then that was developed was that it may not be direct contact between badgers and cattle, very close contact that's resulting in disease transmission, but indirect contact because cattle are maybe grazing over areas that you know, where there are badger latrines or whatever. But you know, there's really very little evidence to suggest that badgers can get TB. Nobody's denying that badgers get TB, and the evidence that's produced when they sort of look at the particular strain of TB that you get in particular areas strongly suggest that when you get outbreaks of TB in cattle, that at some point it can spill over to badgers and perhaps other wildlife as well, because you see the same strains. Not always, but you often see the same strains. So it seems likely that badgers are getting TB from cattle. But there's very little evidence to suggest that there's significant transmission from badgers back to cattle. It might happen occasionally, but all the evidence suggests, as I say, that badgers and cattle tend to avoid each other if they possibly can. You know, the evidence for badgers being a significant source of TB for cattle, I don't believe is really there at all. That's not to say it can't happen. And the question for me has never been whether it's theoretically possible for, you know, cows to catch TB from badgers. That's theoretically possible, of course. They can both transmit the bacterium. The question is whether killing lots of badgers is going to have a significant impact on TB in cattle. And on that point, I think there's very little evidence to suggest that's the case at all.
This probably ties up a little bit with that then. What's the latest update on a cattle vaccine?
So there are trials going on with cattle vaccine. I haven't heard anything recently to tell us where they are. They keep saying that they're putting a lot of effort into developing cattle vaccines. The vaccine that I understand is being trialed is actually BCG, which is basically the same, pretty much the same vaccine that many of us will have had as teenagers. Quite a long time ago for me now. I remember distinctly having my BCG vaccine at school. It's not a tremendously effective vaccine at an individual level. It probably has an efficacy of something like, you know, 50-60% or something like that. But if you, a bit like with the COVID vaccine, if you vaccinate enough of the population, then you can really make a dent in transmission. So the plan would be to vaccinate large numbers of cattle. But one of the problems they have is that vaccinating cattle if you vaccinate cattle, it may mean that you lose export markets. And there's a lot of effort going into ensuring that tests are available that differentiate, so-called DIVA tests that are available that differentiate between cattle that have been vaccinated and cattle that are infected, partly so that you can try and protect those export markets. But yeah, I mean, I understand that field trials are underway.
Great.
But I don't have a timeline, I'm afraid, for when those vaccines might be available.
This one's probably just a best guess, but somebody's asking, is DEFRA thinking to cull all badgers in areas?
Well, no, the answer to that should be no, because they would be breaking international agreements if they wipe out badgers from large areas completely. That said, very early on in the culls, if you go back and look at the original policy document, as I said earlier, the intention was to reduce the badger population by 70% or more in the first year, and then maintain it at a low level for subsequent years, but leaving enough badgers so that they would repopulate the area once you stop culling them. But we saw some that DEFRA never admitted what the upper limit should be on the proportion of badgers that that can be culled within an area. But we saw some advice that was given to DEFRA that said it could be as high as 95%. One of the issues there is, of course, badgers are in the way that they live in the west of England. Badgers are highly social animals and live in quite robust sort of societies, if you like. And if you go killing huge numbers of them over short periods of time, you have massive impacts on that social structure. And where they've done very, very extensive and very intense culling in parts of the Republic of Ireland over the years, they've seen the recovery of badgers in some of those areas has been patchy at best. So it's entirely possible that badgers could be completely wiped out from some areas. They're not going to wipe them out the whole country, but it's entirely possible that we could see badgers completely disappear from some areas, which is really sad and really worrying.
Yeah.
Cheryl, can I just ask this to be the last question now, please?
Yeah, okay, so I see what's going to be probably the best one.
Those of you who haven't had your questions answered, because we've got lots of fantastic questions. Really sorry about that. Okay, thank you, Cheryl.
That's okay. Do you want me to do one last one to finish on?
Yes, please.
Yeah, I think this is probably a nice one to finish on. Why is the emphasis on badgers and not on other mammals, and how can we change the narrative to cattle and away from badgers?
Yes, good question. Bovine TB, Mycobacterium bovis, which is the bacterium that causes bovine TB, isn't a very fussy organism. It will infect just about any mammal, including people. And we always have to remember that the rationale for trying to control TB in cattle really stemmed from the fact that back in the first quarter of the last century, bovine TB was a big problem in people, killed thousands and thousands of people every year. It doesn't anymore. It's a very minor issue for people these days, and that's mainly because we pasteurize milk, and there was that sort of mass vaccination program. And bear in mind, BCG vaccine isn't the human form TB, it is bovine TB that's in the BCG vaccine that they use, or used to use, very extensively in people. So it's really not a problem in people anymore. That I think it's always important to think back and remember that. In terms of other species, yeah, lots of other species can get bovine TB. Badgers do seem to be a species that, because of the way that they live socially in highly social sets and clans where there's a lot of very, very close contact between individual animals. If you introduce TB into a badger population, then they can circulate it within that population, kind of maintain it. Whether they'll maintain it indefinitely in that population, if you eliminate the original source of the infection, which is probably usually cattle, is a different question, and we don't really know the answer to that. But badgers are considered to be the main problem. I think mainly because of the way that they live, and the fact that high densities of badgers are quite sympatric with high densities of cattle in parts of the UK. They tend to like the kind of areas that are used for cattle farming. So I think that's an answer to that question. But, you know, bear in mind, deer species get TB, sheep can get TB, even cats can get TB, domestic cats, and there's been a few cases reported in the veterinary press over the past few years. But most of these species are kind of what you call sort of dead end hosts. They get it, but they don't really spread it very much. Badgers do seem to be able to maintain it and circulate it within their populations. But the question we've always asked is, where's the evidence that badgers are then a serious source of infection back to cattle?
That's great. Well, thank you very much. I'll hand back to Joe in a minute, but I don't think we've had as many questions as this for any of the presentations we had before. So thank you very much. I'll hand back to Joe.
Thanks, Cheryl. Actually, before I go, Cheryl, I noticed there was a comment on there from Pauline Kidner, very famous badger lady. So I don't know if you could just read that one out, because it might be quite nice just to read that one out.
Sorry, do you want to read that out? Because I need to scroll and find it.
Oh, okay. Yes, I'll read it out. That's fine. I just saw it. And Mark, it might be quite nice before we go, I'll stay on for a minute so you can read these messages yourself. Let's have a look. Pauline Kidner. Okay, so she says, at the TB conference, they stated that they are aiming to roll out the vaccine in 2025 for cattle, but it will only be 56% accurate.
Yes, and yeah, thanks, Pauline. And great. I didn't see you in the massive sort of names and the video, but I know Pauline very well. You know, great to see you, Pauline. Hope all's well. So yeah, as I said, 50-60%. I think so. It was 56%. I think was the what they call the efficacy. You know, that gives. It's about 50 to 60% effective at protecting cattle against infection with bovine TB, something like that. What I will do, I'll send this to you, Joe, because I think with Zoom, if you put stuff in the chat, when you close it down, the chat's no longer available. I'll send you links to the paper, but also the correspondence that happened since, with because we were given the opportunity to write quite a long response to DEFRA's corrected graph that might be of interest, and it's all open access, so I can send you those links, and if you want to send them around to people, please do.
We'll send that to our members. That would be greatly appreciated, actually. Okay, well, thank you so much, Mark. So many questions, so many more comments still coming in. I've taken a message actually from the chat box. Somebody used some words there which I thought were perfect. She said, thank you for educating us with your crucial info, which is exactly what you did. So thank you so much. Thank you so much for getting this paper printed into Veterinary Record. Thank you on behalf of my children, the next generation, who will look back at this part of history and will ask questions. I'm still comprehending a lot of this myself. I will look back actually on this talk tonight. I'm actually going to look back on YouTube at this as well, so I can look at this again, and because I've learned so much. So thank you so much. I think we will be seeing you again, Mark, if you don't mind.
Absolutely, I was happy to do whatever we can, really.